Let's take a look at the evolution of the federal system in the U.S. When our founders were developing the U.S. Constitution, they had several influences, including John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, political philosophers who lived in the late 16th and 17th centuries. Thomas Hobbes, in 1651, published a work titled The Leviathan, or The Matter, Form, and Power of a Commonwealth. In the book, it concerns the nature and structure of society and legitimate government. Hobbes rigorously argues that civil peace and social unity are best achieved by the establishment of a commonwealth through social contract. Hobbes' ideal commonwealth is ruled by a sovereign power responsible for protecting the security of the commonwealth and granted absolute authority to ensure a common defense. History indicates clearly that the principal factor in the formation of federal systems of government have been a common external threat. Tribes, villages, cities, colonies, or states have joined together in voluntary unions to defend themselves. And that was certainly the case when the U.S. established itself in 1776 in defense against English rule. A true federal system has three elements. It has a written constitution that divides government powers between the central government and the constituent governments, giving substantial powers to each. A federal system also has different levels of government, through their own instrumentalities, exercising power directly over citizens, unlike a confederation in which only subnational units act directly on citizens, while the central government acts only on the subnational governments. The third element of a federal system is that it has a constitutional distribution of powers that cannot be changed unilaterally by any level of government or by the ordinary process of legislation. In the U.S., there are over 89,000 different governments, including one federal government, 50 state governments, and 89,000 local governments. And local governments include county governments, city governments, town governments, special school district governments, and other special districts. This cartoon illustrates intergovernmental relations. As the character is saying, that's no way to do the job I'm supposed to be doing. And they're looking at the border, the U.S. border. Intergovernmental relations are the sets of policies and mechanisms. They represent federalism in action. For example, on the U.S. border, you have states which manage the borders themselves, and then of course there's a federal role. And also local government roles for cities and towns and counties that are right along the border. Those different levels of government often perform similar functions, and they can in essence get in each other's way. They each have constitutional limitations. An understanding of intergovernmental relations is essential for every public administrator. This area defines the scope and territory of the administrative world in which the public administrator lives. It is not just a question of territorial boundaries. It is equally a question of functional allocations, because most countries have found it necessary to distinguish among national, regional, and local issues, and to allocate them in various ways to different levels of government. This allocation, the question of who does what and with what resources, is the essential core of intergovernmental relations. The most critical dimension of intergovernmental relations, that which forms and shapes the context of every government, is the fundamental settlement or accord by which the government was created. In America, that would of course be the U.S. Constitution. And the Constitution is ultimately, as New York Governor Charles Evans Hughes asserted in 1907, what the judges of the U.S. Supreme Court say it is. Under the American federal system, the most fundamental aspects include the Constitution's provisions in three areas. including, first, the creation of a federal system, that is, one in which there is both a national government and state governments, and a division of powers, or allocation of certain functions to the national government and then down to the state governments. And also, its embodiment of certain principles, particularly through the interpretation of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which provide scope for Supreme Court judgments that can profoundly alter the respective powers and functions of the national and state governments over time. There are, in essence, three categories of federal types of governments. They are outlined in Table 4.3 in the textbook. The first of these is a unitary government. Here, national direction is clear. The central government is superior to the subunits and is the governing unit. All powers emanate from the central government. Examples include Denmark, France, and Japan. Under federal governments, the central government and the subunits share equal power. There is greater scope for diversity and experimentation, and power goes both ways, from the central government out and from the smaller governments toward the central government. The third type would be a confederated government. They are inherently weak as central governments. The subunits are superior to and control the central government. All powers emanate from the subunit governments toward the national governments. And examples of those would include the European Union and the Commonwealth of Independent States, which is the former Soviet Union. Let's turn to the structure of intergovernmental relations. The Constitution itself is the best place to go to answer questions such as which level of government will have overall responsibility for what functions, what functions are shared, how will functions be divided, how to raise revenue to provide those functions, and how much redistribution should take place. The structure of intergovernmental relations is designed to accommodate differing social, ethnic, political, or other communities of interest. A common metaphor used to explain the structure of intergovernmental relations is the marble cake. This metaphor holds that the cooperative relations among the varying levels of government result in an intermingling of activities. This is, in contrast to the more traditional view of a layer cake federalism, which holds that the three levels of governments are totally or almost totally separate. Marble cake federalism is usually associated with Morton Grodzins, who made a famous example out of the cake of rural county health officials called sanitarians. According to Grodzins, it is impossible from moment to moment to tell under which government the sanitarian operates. His work of inspecting the purity of food is carried out under federal standards, but he is enforcing state laws when inspecting commodities that have not been in interstate commerce. Under dynamic federalism, the formal structure of powers, roles, and relationships underlying the intergovernmental relationships of a federal system is rather like the trunk and branches of an old tree. It is always in the wind, leaves come and go, and sometimes entire branches are lost in a storm. The idea of federalism in intergovernmental relations has gone through many phases. Dual federalism was a 19th century concept, now no longer operational. Under dual federalism, the functions and responsibilities of the federal and state governments were theoretically distinguished and functionally separate from each other, much like layer cake federalism described in the previous slide. Under cooperative federalism, there is the notion that the national, state, and local governments are cooperating, interacting agents working jointly to solve common problems, rather than working in conflict, sometimes hostile competitors pursuing similar or more likely conflicting ends. There's also creative federalism. This was inspired by Lyndon B. Johnson's administration, and it was a term coined for its approach to intergovernmental relations, which was characterized by joint planning and decision-making among all levels of government, as well as the private sector, in the management of intergovernmental programs, including Johnson's Great Society programs in the 1960s. New federalism was President Richard Nixon's attempt to return autonomy to the states while maintaining significant levels of federal funding. It entailed establishing aggregate grant levels by formula, but allowing states and local governments substantial latitude in applying the funds in their own areas. President Ronald Reagan sought to apply new federalism to empower state governments and reduce the role of federal government. Under new federalism in the 90s, Republicans sought to push greater responsibilities to the states and away from the federal government. This concludes part 1 of the video. Please continue to part 2.